Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into a forgotten world of winter camps and glowing fires, where ingenuity met survival beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. I'm so glad you're here with me in this quiet moment. Before we begin, I have two gentle questions for you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? There's something beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across different places, yet sharing this same calm space together. Now, let me invite you to settle in completely. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Rest your head on your pillow and allow your body to sink a little deeper into the softness beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your breathing to soften, becoming slower, quieter, like the gentle rhythm of snow falling on pine branches. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind tonight, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. No pressure at all. Just let yourself be here, in this moment, as we travel together through time. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that unfolds across frozen landscapes and starlit winter nights. We'll explore how Native American tribes, long before thermostats, electric blankets, or even wood stoves as we know them, kept themselves warm inside structures we might think impossibly fragile against the cold. Imagine living through winters that could plunge to 40 degrees below zero, with only animal hides, clever engineering, and generations of knowledge between you and the biting wind. It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? But as we'll discover together, these communities didn't just survive winter. They thrived in it, creating warmth, comfort, and even beauty in the heart of the coldest season. So breathe slowly. Let your mind clear like a winter sky after a storm. And let's begin. Let me take you back to a winter evening sometime around the year 1680, deep in the northern plains where the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction and the wind carries stories from 100 miles away. Picture a camp of cone-shaped lodges rising from snow-dusted grassland, smoke curling lazily from their peaks into a sky painted with shades of lavender and pearl gray. Inside one of these teepees, a family sits around a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on walls made of carefully stitched buffalo hides. The structure looks so simple from the outside, just poles and leather, but step inside and you'll discover something remarkable. The teepee, which many plains tribes perfected over countless generations, was far more sophisticated than it appeared. Its conical shape wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it was scientifically brilliant. The steep angle allowed wind to flow smoothly around the dwelling rather than pressing against flat surfaces that might collapse or leak. At the very top, two adjustable flaps called smoke flaps could be repositioned using exterior poles, creating a natural chimney system that drew smoke upward and out while pulling fresh air in from below. Imagine that for a moment. A ventilation system designed centuries before modern engineering, operated entirely by understanding wind patterns and airflow. But the magic didn't stop there. These teepees were often lined with an inner wall, a second layer of hide that hung about 5 or 6 feet high around the interior perimeter. This created an air pocket between the outer and inner walls, functioning exactly like the insulation in your modern winter coat. Cold air would enter at ground level, flow upward through this gap, warm as it rose, and exit through the smoke hole, creating a continuous gentle draft that actually heated the space. The inner liner also prevented drafts from reaching the people sitting inside, and any condensation that formed would drip harmlessly down between the two layers rather than inside the living space. Brilliant, isn't it? The fire itself sat in the center, often in a shallow pit that helped contain heat and prevented sparks from escaping. Tribes gathered specific types of wood that burned steadily without excessive smoke. Cottonwood was a favorite in many regions because it was plentiful and burned relatively clean. In areas where wood was scarce, people used dried buffalo chips, which you might think would smell terrible, but actually burned almost odorlessly and provided steady, lasting warmth. Picture that fire now, glowing softly, the embers pulsing like a gentle heartbeat, radiating heat upward and outward. Now, speaking of that warmth, imagine someone inside that teepee reaching for a small pouch and pulling out something sweet. Let's say dried chokecherries, which tribes across the northern plains preserved by mashing them, sometimes mixing them with animal fat and dried meat to create pemmican. By 1750, this food had become so essential for winter survival that entire communities would gather during late summer to prepare hundreds of pounds of it. The sweetness of the berries balanced the rich, savory fat, a perfect winter treat that could last for years if stored properly. There's something deeply comforting about imagining those flavors mingling in the firelight. The ground itself became part of the insulation system. In autumn, before the first hard freeze, families would pile dry grass, pine needles, or sagebrush around the outer base of the teepee, creating a thick skirt that blocked wind from whistling underneath. Inside, layers of buffalo robes and woven mats covered the floor, adding cushioning and thermal mass. Some tribes even placed heated rocks beneath these robes before sleeping, essentially creating the world's first heated mattress. These stones, warmed by the fire and wrapped in leather, would radiate gentle heat for hours. Children grew up learning the subtle art of fire management. Too large a blaze wasted precious fuel and created uncomfortable heat. Too small and the cold would creep in. The ideal fire was small, steady, almost meditative, just enough flame to warm hands and cook food, with a bed of coals that glowed through the night. Elders taught young people to read the smoke, to know by its color and movement whether the flaps needed adjusting, whether the wood was too green, whether a storm was approaching. Let's talk about clothing for a moment, because staying warm wasn't just about the structure. People wore layers of hide and fur, with the fur often facing inward against the skin for maximum warmth. Mittens, moccasins with thick fur lining, and robes made from entire buffalo hides created a personal microclimate. Imagine wrapping yourself in a robe that weighs 15 pounds, the fur dense and soft, carrying the faint scent of smoke and sweetgrass. That robe wasn't just clothing, it was a portable piece of home. Savory foods played their role too. Picture a clay pot sitting at the edge of the fire, a stew bubbling gently inside, chunks of venison, wild turnips called timsala, dried corn that had been stored since harvest. By the 1600s, trade networks meant some tribes could add flavors from hundreds of miles away, maybe a bit of salt from distant deposits, or herbs traded from southern regions. The steam rising from that pot would carry scents that made the whole space feel alive and nourishing. And here's something that might surprise you. Some tribes created a kind of ancient heat reflector by stretching hides on wooden frames and positioning them behind people sitting near the fire. The hide would reflect warmth back toward the occupants, concentrating the heat where it was needed most. Simple physics, elegant application. As you lie there now, imagine yourself sitting in that space, the fire glowing steadily, the walls gently illuminated, the wind outside held at bay by layers of thought and craft. Your breathing syncs with the slow pulse of the flames. Everything feels purposeful, considered, warm. And as the evening deepens and stories are told in soft voices, sleep begins to feel like the most natural thing in the world. Let your mind rest here for a moment. Feel the warmth. And when you're ready, allow yourself to drift gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore another tribe's approach to winter comfort, one that involves Earth itself. Breathe slowly as we shift our focus now, traveling eastward across the plains to the Missouri River Valley, where the landscape rolls in gentle waves and the riverbanks are lined with thick stands of cottonwood and willow. Here, around the year 1720, we found a different kind of winter dwelling, one that drew its warmth not from the air above but from the earth below. These are the earth lodges of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Iroquois peoples, structures that look from a distance like round hills rising from the prairie, smoke drifting from openings at their crowns. Walking toward one of these lodges on a bitter January day, you'd notice something immediately. The snow around the entrance has melted in a wide patch, revealing dark earth. That's your first clue to the genius of this design. While the air temperature hovers around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the ground just a few feet below the surface maintains a relatively constant temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees year-round. By building partially underground and covering the structure with layers of earth, these tribes essentially lived inside a natural insulator, wrapped in the steady thermal mass of the earth itself. Let me walk you through the construction, which took entire communities working together. First, they'd excavate a circular area, digging down about 3 or 4 feet. Then massive wooden posts, usually cottonwood or cedar, were set in a circle, creating the outer wall. More posts went up in the center to support the roof. Over this framework, they'd lay willow branches in a tight lattice pattern, creating a dome shape. Then came layers of prairie grass, thick and tightly packed. Finally, over everything, they'd pile earth, sometimes 2 feet thick, patting it firm, letting the prairie grass grow back over it until the lodge looked like a natural part of the landscape. The entrance was a covered passageway, a tunnel of sorts that bent at an angle, creating a natural airlock that prevented wind from blowing directly inside. Imagine ducking your head and walking through this passage, the temperature rising with each step until you emerge into the main living space. The central fire pit would be glowing, and you'd feel that wonderful wave of warmth washing over you, the air slightly humid from cooking and breathing, the ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. These lodges could house extended families, sometimes 40 or 50 people, and that human presence itself generated heat. Bodies are furnaces, after all, each person producing roughly the same warmth as a 100-watt light bulb. With dozens of people living together, along with a central fire that rarely went completely out. The interior of these lodges could maintain temperatures of 65 or 70 degrees even when it was sub-zero outside. Try to picture that sense of community, of shared warmth, everyone contributing to the collective comfort simply by being present. Now, speaking of being present, let's talk about an unusual food that thrived in this environment. Prairie turnips, those timsili mentioned earlier, were a staple for these earth lodge dwellers. Women would harvest them in early summer, then braid them into long strings that hung from the lodge's ceiling beams. By the 1780s, ethnographers noted that a single family might dry and store over 300 pounds of these turnips. They have a starchy, slightly sweet flavor, especially good when roasted in the coals or boiled into a thick soup. Imagine the ceiling of the lodge festooned with these braids, along with dried corn, squash, and herbs, an indoor garden of winter provisions swaying gently in the warm air currents. The earth itself worked as a moisture regulator. Unlike tipis where condensation could be an issue, the thick earthen walls of these lodges absorbed excess humidity, keeping the air breathable and comfortable. The dirt floor was often covered with layers of woven mats and buffalo robes, creating a surprisingly soft and clean surface. Sleeping platforms built along the outer walls elevated beds above the floor, where the warmest air naturally settled at night. Let me share a sweet detail with you. These tribes were master gardeners, cultivating strains of corn, beans, and squash that could thrive in short growing seasons. By midwinter, they'd bring out stores of dried corn that had been mixed with buffalo marrow and maple sugar. Yes, maple sugar, traded from tribes further east. They'd grind this mixture and form it into small cakes that children could nibble on during long winter days. Imagine that combination of flavors, the earthy corn, the rich fat, the delicate sweetness of maple. It's the kind of treat that makes winter feel less like an ordeal and more like a season with its own special pleasures. Ventilation in these lodges was ingenious. The smoke hole at the top could be partially covered with a hide on extremely cold or windy days, but the earth walls themselves were porous enough to allow slow air exchange, preventing carbon monoxide buildup while maintaining warmth. On clear winter nights, that smoke hole became a window to the cosmos. Lying on your back, looking up, you'd see stars framed by the circular opening, smoke drifting across them like slow-moving clouds. Communities stored massive amounts of firewood, cottonwood, mainly, which was abundant along the river. It burned fast, so they supplemented it with dried sunflower stalks, corn cobs, and brush. The gathering of this fuel was a communal effort in autumn, with everyone contributing. By the time winter arrived, huge stacks of wood would be piled near each lodge's entrance, enough to last through months of cold. Here's something that might surprise you about these earth lodges. They were often quite beautifully decorated inside. The massive central posts might be carved or painted with clan symbols. Sleeping areas were divided by hanging hides painted with geometric patterns or scenes from important hunts. The effect was of a space that was warm, yes, but also deeply personal, filled with the artistic expression of the people who lived there. Savory meals in winter often featured dried meat that had been pounded into a coarse powder and mixed with dried berries and fat. More variations on pemmican, really. But Earth Lodge peoples also made a kind of stew that involved corn, beans, squash, and whatever meat was available, all simmered together slowly over the central fire. The pot would sit on a bed of coals for hours, the flavors melding, the scent filling the entire lodge with a promise of nourishment. By the 1790s, this dish had become so central to winter life that certain ceremonial occasions revolved around its communal preparation and sharing. As you imagine yourself in this space, notice how different it feels from the teepee. Both are warm, both are ingenious, but this earthen embrace offers something else, a sense of permanence, of being held by the land itself. The walls seem to breathe slowly, the temperature steady, the light soft and golden from the fire's glow. Let your body sink a little deeper into your pillow now. Feel the weight of imaginary earth above you, not oppressive but protective, like a blanket. And as your breathing slows to match the quiet rhythm of this underground sanctuary, allow yourself to drift toward the next chapter, where we'll discover yet another approach to warmth, this time from the woodlands of the east. Gently now, let your awareness shift eastward, beyond the plains and into the forested regions where trees grow so thick that in summer you can walk for days in perpetual green twilight. Here, around the year 1650, in what would one day be called the Great Lakes region, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and other woodland peoples constructed winter homes called wigwams, domed structures that combined flexibility with remarkable efficiency. Imagine walking through snow-covered forest, your breath forming small clouds, until you come upon a clearing where several wigwams sit like smooth white mounds, each one covered in birch bark sheets that gleam pale silver against the snow. These structures were smaller than earth lodges, typically housing a single family, but what they lacked in size they made up for in thoughtful design. The frame of a wigwam consisted of young saplings, usually cedar, ash, or willow, bent into arches and lashed together at the top, creating a dome shape about 12 to 15 feet in diameter. More saplings ran horizontally around this frame, creating a lattice that looked almost like ribs. Then came the outer covering, and this is where different seasons called for different strategies. In winter, these frames would be covered first with woven mats made from cattail leaves or bulrush, materials that had been harvested in late summer and carefully dried. These mats were thick, tightly woven, and overlapped like shingles, each layer shedding rain and blocking wind. Over the mats went sheets of birch bark, that miraculous material that's naturally waterproof, relatively lightweight, and available in large pieces. The bark was held in place with more saplings or rope made from plant fibers. Finally, for extra winter insulation, many families would pile evergreen boughs, spruce, cedar, or pine, around the lower portion of the wigwam, creating yet another barrier against the cold. Inside, the space was cozy and intimate. A fire pit sat in the center, directly below a smoke hole that could be adjusted using two flaps controlled from inside. The floor was covered with mats, then fir or spruce boughs for softness and fragrance, then more mats, and finally sleeping robes made from deer, bear, or moose hide. Lying down in such a space, you'd be cradled in layers, the scent of evergreen rising around you, the fire crackling softly at arm's reach. The Ojibwe had a particular genius for fire management. They understood that a small, hot fire of hardwood, maple, oak, or birch produced more lasting warmth than a large, flashy fire of softwood. Hardwood coals could glow through the night, radiating steady heat while consuming wood slowly. By the 1670s, French traders visiting these winter camps noted with surprise how comfortable the interiors were, often warmer than the drafty log cabins the Europeans themselves had built. Let's talk about a sweet treat that brings me a sense of quiet delight. Maple sugar. By late winter, usually February or March, the Ojibwe would tap maple trees, collecting the sap in birch bark containers. They'd boil this sap down, often in ceramic pots or copper kettles acquired through trade, until it crystallized into sugar. This was one of the only sources of pure sweetness available, and it was precious. Mixed with parched corn or stirred into teas made from wintergreen leaves, maple sugar transformed simple foods into something special. The first sugar of the season was often part of ceremonies giving thanks for the end of winter and the return of abundance. But here's something wonderfully practical about wigwams that speaks to their flexibility. They were portable. When the deep winter settled in, families would establish camps near good hunting or fishing areas, building wigwams that they intended to occupy for months. But when spring approached, or if the game moved to different areas, they could dismantle these homes, roll up the bark and mats, and carry them to a new location. The framework might be left behind or reconstructed with new saplings, trees being abundant in these forests. This mobility meant families could position themselves where resources were most available, adapting to the season's demands. Clothing in these regions reflected the forest environment. Moose hide was particularly prized for winter garments because of its thickness and durability. A moose hide robe, tanned until supple and perhaps decorated with dyed porcupine quills, could weigh 20 pounds and provide extraordinary warmth. Moccasins were stuffed with dried grass or fur for insulation, and people wore multiple layers. An inner robe with the fur facing in, an outer robe with fur facing out, creating air pockets between them. For something savory, imagine a stew that was uniquely suited to winter survival. Woodland peoples would dry fish, whitefish, sturgeon, pike, caught during autumn runs. These dried fish could be pounded into a kind of powder and mixed with dried berries, wild rice, and animal fat to create a nutrient-dense food that could be stored for months. When boiled with water and fresh meat if available, this mixture became a hearty stew that anchored winter meals. By the 1690s, this stew had become so important to winter survival that certain fishing spots where autumn catches were especially good were considered sacred. One detail I find particularly soothing. Many families kept a small supply of sweetgrass braided and dried. When burned, sweetgrass produces a gentle, vanilla-like fragrance that filled the wigwam with a scent of comfort and ceremony. On long winter nights, adding a small twist of sweetgrass to the fire was a simple luxury, a sensory reminder that life offered beauty even in the coldest months. Children in these communities learned from the youngest age how to tend fires without being asked, how to judge when more wood was needed, how to position themselves around the flames to stay warm without crowding. There's something touching about imagining a 7-year-old carefully placing a split log on glowing coals, adjusting it just so, having already mastered this small but crucial skill. Now here's an unusual winter food that always surprises people: lichen. Certain species of lichen, particularly rock tripe, were gathered from trees and rocks, then boiled multiple times to remove bitterness. The result was a gelatinous mass that could be dried into cakes. It wasn't anyone's favorite food. It was fairly bland and required lots of preparation, but during the hardest winters, when hunting was poor and stored food ran low, lichen provided crucial calories. By the 1700s, tribes had developed recipes that mixed lichen with berries and fat, making it more palatable. It's a reminder that survival requires using every available resource, no matter how humble. The wigwam's rounded shape meant that heat distributed evenly, with no cold corners where drafts could gather. The thick layers of insulation, mats, bark, boughs, created that same air pocket principle we saw in tipis, but here the materials were entirely different, drawn from forest rather than prairie. Yet the physics remained the same: trapped air, multiple layers, careful attention to ventilation. Evening light inside a wigwam had its own particular quality, softer somehow than in larger structures, more intimate. The curved walls seemed to gather the firelight and hold it gently, reflecting it back in shades of amber and honey. Shadows moved slowly, like dreams. As you rest now, imagine yourself wrapped in a moose-hide robe, the scent of spruce boughs beneath you, sweet grass smoke drifting lazy spirals toward the smoke hole. The fire murmurs its small songs. Outside, snow falls silently through the forest. Inside, everything is warm, close, peaceful. Let yourself float now toward the next chapter, where we'll explore how peoples of the Arctic, where winter is not a season but a way of life, created warmth in conditions that seem almost impossible to survive. Breathe softly as we travel north now, far north, to a place where winter isn't measured in months but in the long polar night, where the sun disappears below the horizon in November and doesn't fully return until January. Here, in the lands of the Inuit, where temperatures routinely drop to 40 or 50 below zero, we discover perhaps the most counterintuitive form of winter shelter ever devised: a house made entirely of snow. I know what you're thinking. Snow is cold. Snow is what we're trying to escape. Building a house from it seems like building a boat from stones. But let me take you inside an igloo on a night in 1730, somewhere on the frozen sea ice near what would one day be called Baffin Island, and you'll understand the brilliance. First, the construction. An experienced builder could construct a snow house in under 2 hours, working with blocks cut from wind-packed snow. The blocks were arranged in a spiral, each one carefully trimmed to lean slightly inward, creating a dome that supported itself through perfect geometry. The final keystone block at the top locked everything in place. Any gaps between blocks were chinked with loose snow, which would melt slightly from the warmth inside and then refreeze, creating airtight seals. But here's where it gets interesting. Snow is full of air pockets. That's what makes it white instead of clear like ice. And air is an excellent insulator. Those countless tiny pockets in the snow blocks created a barrier that prevented heat from escaping while blocking wind and cold from entering. The thicker the walls, usually 2 or 3 feet thick, the better the insulation. Inside, a platform of snow was built up as a sleeping area, raised about 2 feet above the floor. This elevation was crucial because cold air sinks. The entrance tunnel was also lower than the main floor, creating a cold sink where the coldest air would settle and stay trapped, while warmer air rose into the living space. With a seal oil lamp, just a shallow stone bowl filled with rendered seal fat and a moss wick burning steadily, the interior temperature could reach 35 or even 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not sound warm, but remember, outside it's 50 below. The difference is extraordinary, a 90-degree temperature shift achieved with snow blocks and a small flame. The lamp itself deserves its own moment of appreciation. Called a cullic in Inuktitut, it was tended almost constantly, usually by women who had learned the precise art of keeping the flame even and steady. Too high and it wasted precious fuel. Too low and the igloo grew cold. The lamp provided heat, light for working, and a cooking surface all at once. Imagine the soft golden glow of that flame, reflected on walls that had been carefully smoothed and glazed by the heat until they had a pearly, almost translucent quality. Now, let's talk about food in this environment, because it's fascinating and strange to those of us used to gardens and agriculture. The Inuit diet was almost entirely meat and fat, seal, walrus, fish, caribou, whale. And I want to tell you about muktuk, which might sound unusual but was a sweet delicacy. Muktuk is whale skin with the blubber attached, usually from bowhead or beluga whales. It's eaten raw, frozen, or fermented. The skin is tough and chewy, but the blubber is rich, almost creamy, with a subtle nutty sweetness. By the 1750s, European explorers who tried it often compared the texture to coconut and the flavor to hazelnuts. Rich in vitamins C and D, crucial in an environment with no fruits or vegetables, muktuk was both a treat and essential nutrition. Inside an igloo, people wore surprisingly light clothing because the space was relatively warm. Heavy parkas were hung to dry in the entrance tunnel. Sitting on the sleeping platform, which was covered with caribou and seal furs, you might wear just a light inner layer. The furs beneath you provided insulation from the snow platform, and the combined warmth of bodies, the lamp, and the insulated walls created a microclimate that made sleep not just possible but deeply comfortable. Here's something that surprises people: moisture control. You'd think a snow house would be dripping with condensation, but the porous snow walls actually absorbed moisture from cooking and breathing, preventing it from condensing on people or possessions. Periodically, someone would scrape frost from the interior walls and toss it outside, a simple maintenance task that kept the space dry. For something savory, imagine aged fish. The Inuit would bury fish in the ground before the autumn freeze, letting them ferment slowly over weeks or months. This fermentation broke down proteins into more digestible forms and enhanced certain flavors. When dug up in midwinter, this fish, often char or salmon, had a pungent, strong flavor that many people loved. Eaten raw or lightly warmed on the cullic, it provided intense nutrition. By the 1780s, explorers documented that entire communities would gather for feasts of aged fish, an event that combined social connection with practical nutrition. Light in an igloo had a unique quality. During the day, if the sun was above the horizon at all, the snow walls would glow softly, transmitting diffused light that filled the space with a cool blue-white luminescence. At night, the cullic provided the only illumination, creating a warm contrast to the pale walls. This interplay of light, the cool glow of snow and the warm glow of flame, gave igloo interiors an atmosphere unlike any other dwelling. Storage was built into the design. Smaller side chambers could be carved from the snow, creating cool spaces where meat could be kept frozen but accessible. These were like built-in freezers, maintaining perfect food preservation temperatures without any effort. Now, for an unusual food fact: fermented walrus. This was considered a special delicacy. The meat was placed in a sealskin bag and buried under rocks for months, sometimes years. The fermentation created a strong, cheese-like flavor and a soft texture. It was typically saved for important occasions and shared communally. The first Europeans to encounter this food found it challenging, but for the Inuit, it represented a way of creating variety and depth of flavor in a diet that might otherwise be monotonous. Children played inside igloos with toys carved from walrus ivory or bone. Tiny sleds, animals, dolls. Storytelling was a central entertainment during the long dark months, with elders recounting legends and history while everyone sat close to the lamp's glow. The stories often had rhythms that matched the quiet crackling of the seal oil lamp, a kind of fireside poetry without the fire. One detail that touches my heart: the care taken to smooth the entrance tunnel. It was wide enough to crawl through comfortably, sometimes with a slight upward slope to trap warm air. Coming home to an igloo after a day of hunting in brutal cold, that tunnel was a threshold between survival and comfort, between the indifferent vastness of the Arctic and the small, warm world of family. The temperature gradient in an igloo was dramatic but functional. Down at floor level, it might be just above freezing. At the sleeping platform height, it could be 40 degrees. At the dome's peak, it is even warmer. Sleeping under thick furs at that middle level, you'd be perfectly comfortable, your breath barely visible, the cold world outside held at bay by geometry, insulation, and a tiny faithful flame. Let yourself imagine it now: the soft glow, the close walls, the scent of seal oil and warm furs, voices murmuring stories in a language that rose and fell like wind over ice. Everything necessary is here. Everything is enough. And as you feel that deep, enveloping warmth, let your mind drift gently to the next chapter, where we'll explore how peoples of the Northwest Coast created warmth in rain-soaked cedar forests, where winter meant storms and gray skies rather than snow. Softly now, we turn westward and south, traveling to the misty coastlines of the Pacific Northwest, where winter arrives not with snow but with rain, weeks and months of rain, the sky low and gray as granite, the forest dripping, the sea surging against rocky shores. Here, among the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, and other peoples of this rain-rich region, winter shelter took a different form entirely. Massive houses built from cedar planks, structures so large that multiple families could live together in a single dwelling. Picture this: a house 40 feet wide and 100 feet long, its walls made of thick cedar planks split from enormous old-growth trees. The planks are so large that 3 or 4 of them can span floor to roof, and they overlap like scales to shed the incessant rain. The roof, also cedar planks, slopes gently, channeling water to the edges where it pours off in steady streams. Inside, multiple fires burn along the central axis of the house, each one tended by a different family, each fire with its own smoke hole directly above it. Cedar is the heart of this story. Red cedar and yellow cedar grow massive in this climate, trees that can live 2,000 years and reach 15 feet in diameter. The wood splits cleanly along its grain, is naturally resistant to rot, and has a scent that's both sharp and sweet, slightly medicinal, deeply comforting. Walking into a cedar plank house was like stepping inside a living tree, the air fragrant, the walls glowing with the wood's natural reddish-gold color. But let's talk about how these houses stayed warm, because it wasn't as obvious as in an igloo or teepee. The challenge here wasn't extreme cold. Winter temperatures often hovered around 35 or 40 degrees, but dampness. Wet cold penetrates differently than dry cold, chilling you to the bone, making it hard to ever feel truly warm. These houses addressed this through mass and multiple heat sources. The thick cedar planks provided insulation, yes, but more importantly, they provided thermal mass. Once warmed by the fires inside, the wood itself held that heat and radiated it back into the space, creating a steady ambient warmth. The fires were fed constantly with more cedar, as well as alder and hemlock, woods that burned cleanly and hot. With several fires burning simultaneously, the cumulative heat was substantial. Each family had its own defined space within the house, often separated by hanging mats or carved wooden screens. But the multiple families living together meant multiple bodies generating warmth, multiple hearth fires, a constant activity that kept the space from ever growing truly cold. It was communal living on a grand scale, with all the warmth, physical and social, that implies. Now, let me share something sweet from this culture. Soapberries. These small, tart berries were whipped with a little water and sometimes a touch of precious eulachon oil until they formed a pink foam that looked like clouds. The whipping process was laborious, done by hand in carved wooden bowls, and the result, called Indian ice cream by later settlers, was served at feasts and special occasions. The texture was light and airy, the flavor bright and acidic with just a hint of sweetness. By the 1760s, certain families were renowned for their skill at whipping soapberries to perfect consistency, and being invited to share this treat was a mark of respect. The floors of these plank houses were often covered with woven cedar bark mats, soft underfoot and easy to replace when they wore out. Sleeping platforms ran along the walls, elevated slightly, with storage spaces beneath for food, tools, and ceremonial regalia. At night, these platforms would be piled with furs, sea otter, bear, mountain goat, and wool blankets woven from mountain goat hair or dog hair specially bred for its long, soft fibers. Here's something remarkable about these houses. They were often decorated with extraordinary artistry. Massive house posts carved to represent clan ancestors stood like pillars holding up the roof. These weren't just structural, they were storytelling in wood, each post depicting bears, eagles, orcas, ravens, beings that connected the family to history and cosmos. Even the storage boxes were carved and painted, every object in the house reflecting the belief that beauty and function were inseparable. For something savory, let's talk about salmon, the cornerstone of life in this region. By winter, the autumn salmon runs had ended, but families had smoked and dried thousands of fish, hanging them from the rafters of the plank house where the smoke from the fires would preserve them further. These smoked salmon could be eaten as is, torn into strips with a texture like jerky and a deep, complex flavor. Or they'd be soaked in water to soften, then cooked with seal oil or eulachon oil into a rich, oily stew. Eulachon, small, oily fish that arrived in spring, were rendered for their fat, which was so precious it was used as currency. A spoonful of this oil on dried salmon was a luxurious addition to a winter meal. The smoke from multiple fires did fill the house, especially on wet days when the smoke holes couldn't draw as efficiently. But people adapted, learning to move in the lower levels where the air was clearer and the smoke itself was useful. It preserved food hanging from the rafters and discouraged insects. Over time, the smoke seasoned the cedar wood, darkening it to a rich brown and adding layers to the house's complex scent. On stormy nights, when wind howled off the ocean and rain drummed on the cedar roof, the plank house became a sanctuary. The thick walls muted the storm's fury, the fires crackled defiantly, and the communal presence of dozens of people created a sense of safety and continuity. Children would fall asleep to the sound of rain and the murmur of adult voices telling stories, the same stories that had been told in this same space for generations. Here's an unusual food that speaks to the resourcefulness of these cultures: herring roe on kelp. In late winter or early spring, herring would lay their eggs on kelp fronds in shallow waters. These fronds, coated with thousands of tiny eggs, were harvested and dried. The eggs had a crunchy texture and a briny, slightly sweet flavor. Eaten plain or soaked and cooked, they provided protein and a welcome change from dried fish. By the 1800s, certain bays known for excellent herring roe were owned by specific families, the harvesting rights passed down through generations. The social warmth in these houses was as important as the physical warmth. Extended families, sometimes 30 or 40 people, shared labor, food, stories, and songs. When one family's food stores ran low, others shared. When a child was born, everyone celebrated. When an elder grew ill, everyone helped. This interdependence created a kind of emotional insulation against the hardships of winter. Let me paint you one more image: the firelight reflecting off the polished wood, the carved posts casting long shadows that seem to dance and shift, the furs and blankets creating pools of softness in the vast space, the scent of cedar and smoke and cooking fish, voices rising in song or laughter, the storm outside held at bay by human craft and cooperation. As you rest in your own bed now, imagine that sense of being held not just by walls but by community, by tradition, by the knowledge that you're part of something larger than yourself. Let that feeling wrap around you like a cedar-scented blanket. And now, gently, let yourself drift into the final chapter, where we'll gather all these threads together and reflect on what these ancient approaches to warmth can teach us today. Welcome to this final chapter, friend. We've traveled together across plains and forests, into earth lodges and igloos, through rain-soaked cedar houses and buffalo hide tipis. We've seen how diverse peoples in vastly different environments all solved the same fundamental problem: how to stay warm when the world outside turns hostile. But as we rest here together now, in this quiet space between waking and sleep, I want to reflect on what these solutions mean, not just as historical facts, but as wisdom that still resonates. What strikes me most about all these winter shelters is how deeply they were adapted to their specific place. The plains peoples used buffalo and the open grassland. The woodland peoples used birch and maple and spruce. The Inuit used snow and seal oil. The Northwest peoples used cedar and salmon. There was no universal solution because there was no universal environment. Each culture paid attention, profound, patient attention over generations, to what their land offered and how to work with it rather than against it. This principle of working with rather than conquering seems almost radical from our modern perspective, where we heat homes to 72 degrees regardless of climate, where we seal ourselves in artificial environments disconnected from the world outside. But there's a kind of peace in the old way, isn't there? A teepee that breathes with the wind rather than fighting it. An igloo that uses snow's own properties rather than trying to melt it away. A plank house that accepts rain as part of life rather than something to be defeated. Let's talk about the sweet and savory moments we've encountered in this journey, because food is so central to how we experience warmth. Do you remember the maple sugar stirred into corn, the soapberries whipped into foam, the muktuk eaten frozen under the northern lights? These weren't just calories. They were moments of pleasure, small luxuries that transformed survival into something richer. Even in the harshest conditions, especially in the harshest conditions, people found ways to create delight. By the 1820s, when European and American settlers were pouring into these lands, they often dismissed native housing as primitive, preferring their own log cabins and frame houses. But many of those settlers suffered terribly in their first winters, frozen in structures that looked familiar but weren't adapted to the local climate. Meanwhile, the primitive teepees and earth lodges kept their occupants comfortable. There's a lesson there about the difference between what looks advanced and what actually works. Now, I want to talk about a savory dish that appears across many of these cultures: pemmican and its variations. Whether it was made with buffalo, elk, moose, salmon, or seal, the principle was the same: dried meat pounded fine, mixed with fat and sometimes berries, formed into cakes that would last for months or years. This wasn't just preserved food, it was engineered nutrition, a perfect balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrates designed to fuel a body working hard in cold conditions. The fact that it could be delicious, the richness of the fat, the sweetness of berries, the deep umami of the meat, was a bonus, but also a deliberate choice. People could have stopped at mere preservation. Instead, they created something worth looking forward to. The fires we've encountered in this journey, whether fed with buffalo chips, hardwood, cedar, or seal oil, were all tended constantly. Fire was never something you set and forgot. It required presence, attention, and relationships. In a way, that constant tending was a form of meditation, a practice that kept people connected to the source of their warmth, aware of its fragility and its gift. Children growing up in these cultures learned warmth as a skill, not a given. They learned to read smoke and wind, to bank coals for the night, to judge when more insulation was needed or when ventilation should be increased. This wasn't just practical knowledge. It was a form of literacy, reading the language of fire and air and shelter. Here's an unusual food I haven't mentioned yet that shows up in many cultures: bone marrow. Long bones from large animals would be cracked open, and the marrow inside, rich, fatty, almost buttery, would be scooped out and eaten plain or added to stews. High in calories and nutrients, it was often given to elders, pregnant women, and children. Some cultures roasted the bones first, others boiled them. The result was always richly satisfying, a food that warmed you from the inside out. By the 1840s, European doctors were actually prescribing bone marrow to patients with tuberculosis and other wasting diseases, discovering what indigenous peoples had known for thousands of years. I think about the sleeping arrangements in all these dwellings, always elevated, always layered with furs and woven materials, always positioned to take advantage of rising heat. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a technology of warmth, carefully designed to keep people comfortable through long winter nights. The furs themselves were chosen with care: buffalo for cold but dry conditions, sea otter for damp coastal weather, caribou for the far north where every ounce of weight mattered. There's something about the portability and impermanence of many of these structures that feels important to note. A teepee could be moved, a wigwam reconstructed elsewhere, even an igloo was often temporary. This wasn't because people didn't value home. It was because they understood that adaptation to changing conditions was more important than rigid permanence. When food moved, shelter moved with it. When seasons changed, housing changed too. The communal aspect of warmth appears again and again. Earth lodges and plank houses housed extended families not just for social reasons but for practical ones. More bodies, more warmth, more fire-tending labor shared. Even in smaller shelters like teepees or wigwams, families lived in close proximity to others, camps of dozens or hundreds of people, everyone contributing to the collective survival. There's a kind of warmth that comes from knowing you're not alone, from the murmur of nearby voices and the glow of neighboring fires. Let me share one more sweet detail. Across many of these cultures, the hardest part of winter, usually January and February, had special names and special ceremonies designed to maintain hope. The Inuits sometimes called it the moon when the sun returns. Plains tribes marked it with storytelling ceremonies that lasted days. Northwest peoples held potlatch feasts that redistributed resources and reinforced social bonds. These weren't distractions from the cold. They were acknowledgments that surviving winter required spiritual and emotional warmth as much as physical warmth. As I think about all the foods we've discussed, the chokecherries and timpsila, the maple sugar and herring roe, the salmon and seal, the strange fermented delicacies, I'm struck by how nothing was wasted. Every part of every plant and animal found use. This wasn't romanticized harmony with nature. It was practical necessity elevated to an art form through generations of accumulated knowledge. The materials of these shelters tell their own story. Buffalo hide, flexible and strong. Cedar wood, fragrant and rot-resistant. Snow, paradoxically insulating. Birch bark, naturally waterproof. Earth itself, that steady thermal mass. Each material was used at its best, respected for its properties, incorporated into designs that worked with rather than against its nature. I want you to notice how none of these heating systems relied on sealed, artificially warmed boxes. They all involved some exchange with outside air, some relationship with the environment rather than complete separation from it. The smoke holes, the ventilation systems, the porous walls, all of these maintained a connection between inside and outside, regulated but not severed. Perhaps there's wisdom in that true warmth doesn't require total isolation from the world. By the late 1800s, many of these traditional winter housing methods were being abandoned as native peoples were forced onto reservations and pressured to adopt European-style buildings. Much knowledge was lost in those years, but much remained, passed down through families, documented by anthropologists, and increasingly valued again today as people recognize the sophistication and sustainability of these old solutions. When I think about the children who grew up in these spaces, rocked to sleep by firelight, learning patience by tending coals, hearing stories and voices they'd known since birth, I imagine a particular kind of security that came not from wealth or power but from competence and community. They knew how to be warm because they practiced it every day, participated in it, understood it not as a mystery but as a skill. The winter stories told in all these cultures often featured animals. How ravens stole the sun, how bear learned to sleep through winter, how salmon promised to return in spring. These stories kept the natural world present even when it was hidden under snow or shrouded in storm. They reminded people that winter was part of a cycle, that warmth and cold danced together in an eternal pattern. As we come to the end of our journey tonight, I want to leave you with this thought. All of these people understood that warmth wasn't something you conquered or controlled completely. It was something you negotiated with, adapted to, created through attention and effort and cooperation. The fire had to be fed. The smoke flaps had to be adjusted. The entrance had to face away from the prevailing wind. These weren't inconveniences. They were the price and practice of comfort. In our modern world, we often imagine comfort as something passive, something that happens to us. Thermostats that regulate temperature automatically, homes that seal us away from weather entirely. But maybe we've lost something in that convenience. Maybe the active practice of creating warmth, the tending, the adjusting, the attention required, was part of what made it meaningful. So as you lie in your bed tonight, under your blankets, in your heated home, perhaps you can imagine for just a moment what it would be like to sit by a fire you built yourself, in a shelter you constructed with your own hands or helped raise with your community, eating food you hunted or gathered or grew, telling stories that had been told for longer than anyone could remember. Not to romanticize hardship. Those winters were hard, survival was uncertain, suffering was real, but to appreciate the skill, the knowledge, the profound adaptation that our ancestors achieved. Let yourself feel grateful for the warmth you have, however it comes to you. And let yourself feel connected, through this story, to all the people who ever huddled against winter darkness, tended a fire, shared a meal, told a story, and kept each other warm. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me. I hope it brought you some measure of peace, some quiet wonder at human ingenuity, some appreciation for the warmth that surrounds you. If you drifted into peaceful sleep somewhere along the way, then this story did exactly what it was meant to do. If you're still here with me now, feeling drowsy and calm, then perhaps sleep isn't far behind. If this journey helped you unwind, if it eased your mind even a little, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Which shelter would you have wanted to experience? Which food surprised you most? What part of the story carried you closest to sleep? Until we meet again in another story, another time, another quiet exploration of the past, sleep well, friend. Let the warmth surround you. Let the darkness be gentle. Let your dreams be peaceful. Sweet dreams.